You guys should probably see a red light somewhere. Okay. All right. Hello. Welcome to another PharmaCon panel. I hope everyone watching has been soaking up all the pre-recorded panels and readings that we've been doing and participating in the Zoom Hangouts. We're here on this panel to talk about Philip Jose Farmer's novel Up from the Bottomless Pit, which is about a huge offshore oil spill, as well as the broader topic of environmental science fiction in general. Let me introduce everybody on the panel. Most Farmer fans are familiar with Christopher Paul Carey. He is the co-author with Philip Jose Farmer of The Song of Kwasin, the concluding novel in the Ancient Opar main series, and the author of the novellas Exiles of Ko, Hayden, King of Opar, and Blood of Ancient Opar. He acted as copy editor of Farmer File back when we first serialized the novel Up from the Bottomless Pit between 2005 and 2007. And he was the editor of the limited edition collection Up from the Bottomless Pit and Other Stories when Subterranean Press published it in 2007. His foreword to the Sub Press edition appears in the Meteor House edition. This is a proof of it. We don't have the printed books quite yet. And today he is currently the director of publishing at Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated. Our other guest panelist, Charmin Apt Russell, may not be familiar to most Farmer fans. We're very lucky to have her here today. She is a nature, science, and science fiction writer who has a very long list of awards for her fiction and nonfiction. She lives in the magical realism of the American Southwest and writes both adult and children's literature on a ridiculously wide range of topics, including citizen science, living in place, archaeology, flowers, butterflies, hunger, and pantheism. And we at Meteor House are very pleased that when we reached out to her to see if she was familiar with Phil's work and would be willing to write the introduction to Up from the Bottomless Pit, which we pitched as a novel by him, about a major ecological disaster, she immediately said, I'm a fan of his work, haven't read him in a while, and I'd love to get back into it. She immediately said yes, so we're very, very thankful for that. And she is uniquely qualified to write on this subject as she holds a bachelor's in conservation and natural resources and a master's in creative writing. She's also a professor emerita at Western New Mexico University, where she teaches writing for grad students. And I should also point out that Chris's undergrad degree is in archaeology and his master's degree is in creative writing. Now, I'm just a guy with an engineering degree who got into publishing because I can't write. So I'll let everybody know my name is Michael Croteau. I'm one of the owners of Meteor House, and I'm one of the organizers of PharmaCon. And since I have these two brilliant people here with me, hopefully they'll do most of the talking after this. Now, let me just start out by saying, for those who don't know, Phil originally wrote Up from the Bottomless Pit for Ballantine, a science fiction publisher, in the late 1970s. Now, the editor, Judy Lynn Del Rey, wasn't happy with the book. She asked for some rewrites. He did those. She asked for some more. And I think Phil just got weary of it, and he kind of gave up on the book. He turned around and wrote Dark as the Sun, which is one of his longest novels, handed that in. It's set billions of years in the future, has tons of science fiction ideas and stuff in it, and they immediately accepted that. My first question for the panel here, and it's total speculation, we're just totally guessing, is, why didn't Ballantine write this book or want to publish this book? Could it be because there wasn't enough science fiction? I almost equate it to if you've ever read Clive Cussler. It's set slightly in the future, and there's some technology we don't have. And there's action, adventure, and government agencies and all this kind of stuff. But it's not your typical farmer science fiction. Or in the late 70s, was there any sort of bias against pro-environmental works? That's something I kind of wonder about. So I don't know who I directed that question to. Maybe Charmin's the expert on environmental science fiction, if she wants to maybe take a stab at that, or.
Well, I admit I'm not expert on environmental science. I did look up history of oil spills, and I can say that the 1970s saw more oil spills than in the next few decades or in the 21st century. And it had some major oil spills as well. And that at the end of the 1970s, probably because of this profusion of spillage, there was more regulation and more protection put in. So it's even odder that a publisher wouldn't want to publish it, since probably oil spills were in the news a lot, and people were, you know, concerned about it.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, I guess I have to almost speculate that it's because there just wasn't enough science fiction for Ballantine. You know, I refer to it as a near mainstream novel. You know, so maybe that was just the case there. Do you have any thoughts on that, Chris?
Yeah, I'm pulling up some publication dates here. Wanted to see when, to kind of bolster my theory here. Yeah, okay. So I have to wonder if he wasn't just being typecast, you know, as a science fiction writer. And this book wasn't, even though it is prognostication, it is true science fiction in the Jules Verne type sense. It's you know, it's not on another planet. It's not with aliens. It's not with the typical science fiction tropes. It's more about the, you know, prognostication. So Phil was, I was just checking the publication date of like The Dark Design, which came out in like 1978. So that would have been somewhere around that time. And you know, so he was really at, like, he had won earlier in the decade, he had won the Hugo Award for To Your Scattered Bodies Go. And Riverworld was a big thing in science fiction. So he was primarily known at the time for Riverworld. That, I mean, that's what was on the stands. And I think that you know, Judy Lynn Del Rey, like, just jumping on Dark of the Sun when he put it out, because she was like, oh, this, you know, she's probably, I would assume, this is more what we want. This is what we can sell with your name on it. So I think from the practical publishing aspect, it might have had less to do with the environmental content, other than the fact that it's not like that typical science fiction. It's more of a disaster.
That sounds, yeah, that sounds perfectly true. Absolutely. I mean, the bottom line for a publisher is to stay in business and to sell books and to, you know, have an author who will continue to sell books and kind of their, you know, their golden goose kind of person. And so, yeah, that makes sense to me in terms of my experiences with publishers.
Yeah, mine too. We get typecast.
Right.
So.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that
well,
I'm sorry, go ahead, keep going.
I'm done.
I was just going to say that exact explanation hadn't occurred to me. I was thinking along those lines, but no, that's a great point. You know, you think of Phil, you think of these really big, crazy, wild science fiction ideas. And so I'm surprised Phil didn't just give it to his agent and say, you know, see who else might be interested in this. I'm surprised he put it back in the trunk.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm glad because, you know, I discovered it years later in the magic filing cabinet and we got to put it in Farmer File. But
I think Phil could sometimes just, you know, as part of his psychology, just having known him and seeing how he reacted to things at various times. I think that when he got frustrated, he kind of just was like, I'm done with it. You know, like I remember he was giving an interview with Will Murray and Starlog, and they were talking about reprinting his various books. And he's like, oh no, like, you know, no one wants to see that one again. I'm going to put that one in the trunk. You know, I'm going to retire that one. I think that was the terms he was using. And all these amazing science fiction novels, he was talking about retiring. And I think at the end of the article, Will put a commentary that said, since this interview was done, Phil has changed his mind about it. But I think sometimes he would just, you know, like, I'm done. Like I mean, it was probably a fairly grueling thing to have to rewrite that novel, because he did a major rewrite on it, I believe. and the suggestions kind of went against the grain of what he wanted to do with the story. They were suggesting, what was it? Was it making the protagonist
turn out to be the bad guy in the
to
end?
be the bad
That was
guy,
one
you
of
know,
them.
and that's a huge leap for a writer to make, you know, when you have that character created, and then, you know, everything in that novel is created to make that character be, say, the protagonist in this case, and then to have to pull the rug out from under that, you know.
Yeah.
And I don't think he did that. I mean, like he never wrote a version like that. So yeah.
Not that I've seen.
Yeah, so he was clearly frustrated with the editorial feedback. So
Yeah, they wanted a different book.
yeah, I think so. So they got it. This is Dark of the Sun. If you haven't read it, it's a very good book.
There you go. Yeah, I grabbed mine earlier just to see how many pages it was, and the hardcover was like 402 pages. So
Yeah,
one of his longer novels.
yeah.
Here's another thing to speculate on, and again, a question we don't really have an answer to, but you know, as we were saying, The Dark Design had just come out, the 4th book in the Riverworld series. Phil was, you know, selling books like crazy. He was top of the charts for the science fiction lists. And I'm wondering, if this book had come out with his name on it, what impact do you think this might have had back then? Would anyone outside of science fiction have even noticed? What, you know, might this book have had any lasting effect? Might anybody have sat up and taken note and said, hey, maybe we should have a better response team standing by ready for things like this? Or I don't know, you know, wishful thinking probably. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that aspect of it or not.
I do. I have some thoughts. I mean, again, at that time, there was some changes in regulation and in protection of the oceans because of these major spills. So people were doing some of that. But, and this is a little bit of a digression, but I've been thinking lately about the most pragmatic way to address climate change. And of course, that's one of the big topics in science fiction, which maybe he would have been tackling. And one of the new theories is the most pragmatic way is not to have big marches or to encourage collective action like eating less meat and bicycling more. But since we have to do things really quickly to avert more global warming, is to try and influence key decision makers. So, you know, there's only like 20 countries in the world that emit the most carbon dioxide emissions. In the United States, for example, it's just in a few sectors where we emit the most greenhouse gas emissions. And in those sectors, there's just a few decision makers. You know, there's like 250 utility commissioners in the United States. And they determine how power is used and how, if power is green, and, you know, they have a lot of influence, and CEOs, et cetera, et cetera. So would his book have made, you know, had an impact? So my new idea is, and it's just speculative, is it doesn't have to reach a mass audience. I mean, if it does, that's great, because there's more chance that it's gonna end up in some dad's office or something. It just has to reach some key people. I mean, so it's all this kind of contingency, this parallel world, if you want. If that book had, it's a compelling, powerful, scary story. And if it had been read by a few key decision makers, then sure, I think it could have had an impact. You know, I think of Bill Gates, who was a great CEO in business, in computers. Why is Bill Gates now one of the major players, him and his foundation, in solving tropical diseases, finding a vaccine, and working in undeveloped countries? So what story, what contingency, what happened to Bill Gates? I mean, I always think it's his wife, Melinda, but still, I don't know. What story, you never know what's going to influence someone. And of course, it turns out that a lot of our problems return to a few key decision makers. So that's my thought about that. Who knows? But maybe, sure, maybe.
Wow, that's a great thought. Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of where I wasn't thinking I was kind of thinking the same thing. I was going to say, well, you know, these things don't really usually have an impact. And it's usually whenever there's a big news story and then they point to a science fiction novel, it's something that was ignored, you know, and then they're like, well, look, so-and-so knew about it, you know, 100 years ago, but nobody did anything about it. So I think that Sharman is right there. But I had the same thought. I was thinking more along the lines of, you know, what if scientists and people in industry or whatever, you know, somebody read that, just as if a lot of like people in NASA, for instance, like a lot of the people working on the aerospace were inspired by Star Trek or Edgar Rice Burroughs or Jules Verne or whoever, you know.
Robert Heinlein.
But that's a great point about like if a policymaker who was reading it, who had read that at the time, that could be that could have been a huge thing. So I'm along the same lines. I think it's more the key individuals who would have read it, who could have fostered some change because of that.
Yeah, policy. It's a boring subject, but it's actually, you know, a big driver of what happens in our world.
Absolutely.
I've got my next question here, and I can't remember if we've already discussed it for some reason.
It's because we went over the questions earlier.
Because we went over the questions ahead of time. So let me throw this out there. If we've already talked about this, just let me know. We'll move on. But I feel like we've already kind of hit this a little bit. But one thing Chris mentions in his foreword, which was in the Subpress edition and is in our edition, that we feel, you know, Phil really got right was while we were serializing that novel in Farmer File, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. And if everyone remembers just how bad the government's response was to that, how slow it was, how half-assed it was, you know, Phil predicted that 25 years. And now here we are bringing the book out again, and we're in the middle of a pandemic, and the government's response has been slow and terrible and you know, completely inept. And Paul and Wynn and I, my two partners at Meteor House, we kind of joked, you know, God help us all if anybody ever tries to make a movie out of this book. Who knows what, you know, what catastrophe will be in the middle of it, you know, by then. But it is kind of amazing, you know, science fiction authors are notoriously bad at actually predicting the future unless they're really trying to do that. But Phil absolutely nailed, you know, that part of it. When you read the book and you're just like, wow, how can this still be happening today? It's crazy.
Since I was, you know, there when this was being published, and we were, you know, seeing Katrina. I remember. I'll answer that first, but I remember firing off emails. You know, we were exchanging emails, and we're like, "Can you believe this? This is like, this is bizarre," you know. And he predicted so many the general details of how the failure happened in government and various aspects of that. I mean, he talked about the consolidation of power too, like how there was you know, the government had to just really step in there and kind of like throw aside all these, you know, rights and you know, and regulations and laws and stuff like that, just to respond to this crisis because it was so immense that you couldn't take care of it in any other way. And then he talked about the bureaucratic response to it and how they screwed it up. And, you know, everyone remembers the, you know, the FEMA response and the heck of a job brownie and all that. But I just wanted to see here. I have the book in front of me here. It was so. Here's an interesting paragraph. I'm just going to read it, but it's talking about the response. You know, none of this was done without trouble. The taxpayer cried out too because an additional 10% was added to the income tax. The government informed the public just why this was necessary, but only Southern California accepted the additional burden because they're being faced with the direct crisis. It was difficult to get most Americans remote from the coast to fully comprehend that they were as endangered as those living next to the oil stream. They had now been told again and again via mass media that starvation from lack of food and of oxygen might result, but this was too vast a concept for most Americans to visualize. And oh my gosh, I mean, if that's not what we're going through right now, you know, with the coronavirus pandemic,
Right.
you know, and the response to it, and then the reaction of the public. Not only that, so he not only got the failure of the government and the American people to understand the gravity of the situation and how to respond to it, but he also talked about extremism in it. You know, you have this extremist, like, you know, very, you know, this kind of religious, far right extremist group that causes all sorts of trouble during this disaster. And, you know, we're definitely seeing in this current crisis a polarization. And that's, you know, kind of screwing up the response to this whole crisis. And, you know, you know, you hear on the news all the time now, the virus doesn't care. Well, you know, in Phil's book, the oil spill didn't care. It's still gushing out the oil, you know, and people have to get their act together. And I think that was a sort of a common theme throughout a lot of Phil's work, because he began, it's interesting, we talk about science fiction versus, you know, like more mainstream story. This is more like a Michael Crichton-esque type novel. He began his career as a mainstream writer. He just failed at it. So, you know, in this original collection, which is out of print now and very, very expensive on the market, although there's an ebook of it. That's all of his kind of mainstream stories in it that he wrote, you know, 1940s, mainly 1940s and 50s. And he, you know, he was a realist at heart, you know, and I think because he came out of that, he wasn't writing science fiction when he started out. He was a keen observer of the human condition, you know, and he had a lot of background in anthropology and frankly, all the sciences. And so he would look at humanity and give his honest assessment of what he thought. It wasn't an idealistic thing. Like he grew up reading a lot of kind of idealistic fiction when he was very young, like Edgar Rice Burroughs obviously influenced him, and Doc Savage and stuff like that. But he was not, he did not have a simplistic or idealistic worldview. It was a practical worldview. I mean, just read the Riverworld novels, you know, and you'll see that it's a big allegory about how humanity, you know, responds to, I mean, that's also like, how does humanity respond to that very bizarre situation where everyone wakes up, everyone who's ever lived and died wakes up on another planet. And we see the human vices and the human weaknesses and the human frailties take hold. But you also see, much more rare, you see the human courage. And that's usually his protagonists who step up, but they're usually in the minority. So I think he really nailed so much with this book. It is uncanny, but I think it's because he was so keenly observant of the human condition, you know, and so that's why he was able to do it, whereas somebody else might have told, some other science fiction writer might have gone off in another direction, you know. So that's my spiel on that.
No, that's great. I wish if we had talked about this sooner, I would have changed the name of this panel to Keenly Aware of the Human Condition, because it's just a great way of describing Phil.
Yeah.
That really is. Now, it's interesting he wrote this book. You know, I feel like Phil was always very interested in the environment, but as I went back and looked through, and Chris, I think, is going to find some more examples, I think his main concern was really overpopulation and what that was doing to the planet, including pollution and running out of farmland and stuff like that. So that was, there's this one, I've always enjoyed this story he wrote called, I think it's called 70 Years of Deck Pop being decreased population, where a virus hits Earth and basically 99% of people become sterile. And so he shows over the next 7 decades what happens as there are fewer and fewer and fewer people. And I think Phil looked at that as a happy story. like this could be the best case scenario for us, basically. Is how I think he looked at it. But a lot of his books that are set in the far future, there are some where there's aliens and we're on other planets and we have space flight, but a whole lot of his stuff set in the future is like Flesh and the Cachet and the Stone God Awakens to some extent. Dark as the Sun, where society has devolved. People are basically hunter-gatherers and living in tribes, and there might be some technology that they have no idea what it actually was originally that's left over. And those were, I think, some of his favorite novels to write. What would Earth be like, 100,000 or 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,000 years in the future when there's just a handful of people and all this stuff flying around? I think that I feel like he enjoyed writing those kinds of novels as opposed to the typical, like Asimov's Foundation series and giant computers that cover entire planets and things like that. He wasn't nearly as interested in. He did a little of that, but the Boojum, I think Chris wrote a story about. I think that was what it was called. Sorry, throwing that at you out of the blue. I can't remember the name of it. Anyway, I want to see what you guys thought about Phil's take on environmentalism. It wasn't a major theme throughout, like sex and religion and all these other things he always wrote about, but I feel like a lot of times it was there to one extent or another. It was something he was always concerned about.
Well, he grew up at a time when people were really concerned about overpopulation. Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, came out in the 60s. It was in all the college curriculums. It was all the thoughts. People were thinking about overpopulation all the time. They were thinking about hunger all the time. There's real fear of worldwide famine. That's how the Green Revolution kind of came up, out of trying to deal with this fears of mass hunger and mass, deaths. So it was in the air. It was culturally a really strong idea, overpopulation, a fear of the future.
Let's see. I kind of went and was. I had this thought in my mind. I was like, I've read something in an interview where Phil mentioned a similar, because I totally agree with you, Mike. I think that he saw that as a good thing. Like if humanity actually regressing technologically might be a really good thing for humanity. And that was sort of his Mark Twainian, sense of irony, coming in about the human condition. But you actually asked him about his speech "Reap" in an interview that you did. It's one of my favorite interviews with Phil. So "Reap" was a speech that he gave at which was at Baycon.
Baycon, the Worldcon in 1968 in San Francisco.
1968. So, and that was all about the Triple Revolution document, which was a proposed response to all the crises going on with just socially and in the environment and everything. The Triple Revolution. I don't know a whole lot about that. Maybe Sharman has more info about that. But REAP, he proposed the formation of an organization called REAP, which stood for Rights, Economy of Abundance, Peace, or Rich Earth and People. And it's kind of notorious because he went, the story goes that he went on and on during that speech. His version of the story is, I think it was Harlan Ellison and Robert Silverberg went on and on before he went on. So everyone was tired by the time they got to his speech. So he was kind of frustrated about that he got blamed for that. But it is a long speech, and it was supposedly a very hot room that they were all in, and people were falling asleep and everything. There's some irony right there. you asked him about that speech in an interview in, I don't know when you conducted that interview, but late 90s,
Late
I would
90s.
say. And he said, he had this response, and I've always remembered it. He said, as far as I'm convinced, and I think I'm right, in that the continuing overpopulation and dwindling of our natural resources, including water, farmland, and so forth, are going to meet in the next century, maybe in 2020 or 2050. I don't know. And then this is the part that always stuck in my mind. Then there is going to be a collapse of civilization at which everyone laughs. They can't conceive it, but they don't have the imagination. And that's a common thing. Like, I mean, that's exactly up from the bottomless pit, right? Like, people didn't have the imagination to be able to, like, to comprehend what was going on and to respond to it, you know? And so but he did sort of romanticize that collapse of civilization. And you see that in various books. I'll talk about Opar just very briefly, just because that's what I'm the Opar guy, continued Phil's Opar series. But, that book had environmental topics in it too. It was set during the late ice age, the end of the ice age, when there was a change in climate, which allowed for the Sahara was basically a Mediterranean environment at the time, and that's like the area of like Lake Chad was at that time, according to the series, there were two great inland lakes there, and there's two giant basins in Africa, and they were filled with water at the time in the series. And but if you read further in that series, there's a great cataclysm that happens, and then there's another change in the climate because the oceans drain. There's a break in the cliffs that hold in the Southern Sea, and both seas are connected. And so what that causes is the draining of the seas and the drying out of Central Africa. And so that spells doom for the Kokarsan civilization, and then like that kind of romanticism of that. In Time's Last Gift, Phil has his Tarzan analog character, John Gerbardson, go back in time, chiefly because he just wants to get out of the present day. It's set in our future, Tarzan, John Gerbardson, just wants to get away from civilization. So he orchestrates the circumstances to create a time machine, and then goes back in time and ends up staying back there in time. He doesn't, spoiler, he doesn't return with the rest of the expedition. And then I looked up some other things. The interview with Lord Greystoke is interesting. He said, first of all, he says, he has Tarzan say in the interview, like Mark Twain, I have only one prejudice, that is against the human race. Again, this sort of, Mark Twain irony, so, and then he has Tarzan say, they're talking about Tarzan and Jane faking their deaths because people are caught on to their immortality. And he says, it says he may go back to the jungle. And he says, the rainforest may disappear someday, but I think that worldwide population is going to result in the collapse of civilization and a drastic reduction of the population. Perhaps the forest will be spared after all, and many of the species now threatened with extinction will come back. So there again, he's romanticizing that idea that if humanity collapses, maybe it's better for us all. Like if civilization collapses. And then I was thinking about. I'll get the day world later. That's the obvious one because that's dealing with overpopulation. But there's image of the beast, begins with that very strong image of the like, I think it's like green poisonous smog, and this is in LA in the early 1970s when smog was a huge issue. I mean, it still is, but it was worse then. And then I was thinking about Riverworld. You had that the ethicals created like this ecosystem that was totally 100% self-recycling ecosystem, if you remember. So that was an interesting thing. That kind of goes off my thesis here, but I had it in my notes. But in World of Tears, you remember Earth 2? You find out that Red Orc created a second Earth, and you find out that it's less environmentally damaged than our Earth because it's not as advanced technologically. He basically took the exact same situation, like same number of humans, he recreated 2 exact Earths and let them go. One of them wasn't as bad, and then the other one was our Earth with all its ecological problems and everything, and but that sense of realism, when I was looking through it, he talks about going to Kikaha goes to the Los Angeles area of Earth 2, and there's this line. It says, "This city had its equivalent of LA smog. The smoke from thousands of kitchen fires hung heavy over the valley." And again, that's that realism. He's not there he's not so much idealizing it, because even though he speaks sort of of idealism, that Phil, if he ever wrote stories about it, which he sort of did, he would portray the human condition as it really is. So Red Orc says, of these 2 different parallel Earths, I've read them as experiments, and I can now predict what's going to happen to their people. Earth 1, that's our Earth. Earth 1 humans will kill almost all of themselves with their brainless breeding, poisoning of the land, air, and sea, and in the end, the collapse of civilization followed by starvation. Then the survivors, the plunged into savagery, will start climbing back to civilization, science, and technology, only to repeat the same story. This will eventually happen on Earth 2, the one that's not as advanced and doesn't have as many environmental problems. And then he's like, why should I continue with the experiments now that I know what the results will be? So he's going to abandon his experiments. And then Two Hawks from Earth also deals with an Earth 2, a parallel Earth. And it basically, he has the migration of the Native Americans is different, basically, in the proto-Native Americans. So that they don't go over to North America, if I remember correctly, and they instead go down into Europe, and they go the other way rather than going over the land bridge. They go, the peoples of Siberia region and all that go the other way, and so you have a sort of less. They do have technology, but it's sort of a bit backwards from our technology, and you see a lot of Native American influence in it. And so he dealt with these issues, I think, throughout all of his works. Sorry to go on this long.
No, that's why you're here.
Version here, but I think he was just constantly thinking about that kind of thing, because he thought about all the implications of everything. He was that's why he was such a good science fiction writer. If you read his books, there's an interesting little stylistic thing that he does. Is he'll write. And he'll have a paragraph that's a thesis about something. The protagonist is thinking something. Well, this is going to happen because of this and this and this. And then at the end, he puts this last line in the paragraph, or he'll do a single line next paragraph, where he said, or the opposite will happen. Like he'll give like a totally different counterpoint to it, because he was always trying to think through all the different possibilities of what was going to happen. That's the hallmark of a great science fiction writer. He was always even questioning himself, I think. But he was a Renaissance guy, really.
He really was. He had so many different interests. If you ever got to visit his house and look through like his basement, just all the books that were out there. He just read on everything. And I think I've said this before, I think he remembered almost everything he read. and then tried to put it in a book or a story somewhere.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, I'll leave with a quote from, because he also, as I guess my point is, he's really reflecting the age he was in, and he is reflecting the environmental movement. In 1864, George Perkins Marsh was one of our early environmentalists. And of course, the environmental movement really came out of a response to the Industrial Revolution. People were appalled. And so George Perkins Marsh wrote, and it sounds like something Phil could have written, the ravages did by man subvert the relations and destroy the balance which nature has established, and she avenges herself upon the intruder by letting loose her destructive energy. So he predicted climatic excesses, and of course we're looking at deforestation of the East. They were looking at, so within environmentalism has always been an anger and a frustration with how humanity has treated the natural world. There's always been, I'm speaking purely myself, a love affair with the Paleolithic, which we sometimes call the Paleo-terrific. This urge to, hit the reset button. Let's just start again. Let's, and within that, just what kind of pragmatism too, knowing that that probably will do the same things over again, but also that it wasn't ideal then either. That human nature, the environmentalism would like to have this kind of Garden of Eden that they can go back to, and the Paleolithic seems like that. And when you think of hunting and gathering societies, culture staying the same for 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 years, maybe it was kind of ideal in some ways, but we did move on. So anyways, he's very much reflecting the ideas of environmentalism and the ideas of Western culture as it moved on from the Industrial Revolution and kind of had to deal with all the consequences of it.
Charmin, have you ever read Phil's novel Time's Last Gift?
Not, a lot of what I was reading in Phil, I was much younger, so I don't remember it definitely.
Okay, no problem. When I send you your copy of the book, when it comes out, I'm going to throw a copy of Time's Last Gift, there we go, in the box.
Great.
You will, many people count that as their favorite farmer novel, and I have a feeling you will as well.
Okay, yeah.
All right, she gave us her last thoughts, and I should have warned her about this. Normally at FarmerCon, if we had held it in person, there's a very slim chance that you would have actually come all the way to Pittsburgh just to be there, maybe get you to sign books. But what we always do is all of our friends, Meteor House will get 4 or 5 tables. We're selling all of our books, and all of our friends that are there have their books on the table for sale as well. And I'm just wondering if there's anything you want to tell everybody watching. What was the last book you had come out? What are you working on now? What's coming out soon? Any sort of promotion you want to do? Now's your chance.
I'll go ahead, it's probably not specific to your audience. I did have the science fiction book, so it's Knocking on Heaven's Door. So that's out, and it is set in the future, but it's the reset button, and we've gone back to Paleo-terrific times. But again, it's not ideal. So probably that's the one I should mention. Knocking on Heaven's Door. Yeah.
All right, I will definitely put a link to that in the bottom of this video when I figure out how to do all that. Knocking on Heaven's Door. Okay, great. And Chris, what do you have going on these days?
Let's see. Let me just promote my latest thing. I have a novelette in the back of this book here, which the company I work for, Egg Race Burrs Incorporated, just published. It's a story called very similar to a Philip is a Farmer title, actually, but it's actually, I was inspired by a Tom Petty song. But Pellucidar, Dark of the Sun. That's actually available right now. So you can get that on Amazon or eggraceburrows.com. And I will be writing a novel set in the Egg Race Burrows universe that'll come out next year called Victory Harbin Fires of Halos. So.
Nice. I didn't realize Tom Petty wrote a song with Pellucidar in the cover, in the title.
No, Dark of the Sun, he had a song. Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. I noticed your novel was named after a Bob Dylan song. I'm a huge Bob Dylan fan, so.
Yeah.
Wait, Up from the Bottomless Pit was, or which novel was named after? Or Knocking on Heaven's Door?
Knocking on Heaven's Door.
Knocking on Heaven's Door, right, yeah.
Love that song. In fact, one of my bands plays that song. We close every gig with it and introduce the band during the end.
Knock, knock, knock. Yeah, right. I'm a big Tarzan fan. I was reading those a lot, you know. I mean, those books kind of, we imprint on them. And I bet a lot of environmentalists did too, because we imprinted on his intimacy with the natural world, you know, and our desire, again, to kind of go back to some kind of Garden of Eden where we were, you know, where we felt more connected to it.
Yeah, that's, so one of our good friends, Win Scott Eckert, I don't know if you dealt with him, and with, he's also on board at Meteor House, but he's writing a novel has written a novel for me that's coming out not too long, called Tarzan Battle for Pellucidar. So it's a farmer and burros go very close hand in hand.
Indeed.
So
we don't know. Meteor House was lucky enough to be able to reprint Phil's Tarzan novel, The Dark Heart of Time, 2 years ago, or was it last year? I think it was 2 years ago.
2 years ago.
This year, if we were there at Pulp Fest, at FarmerCon this year, we'd have this book, obviously. And this is actually the cover. This is an early version of the cover. We've since changed the cover a bit. So it looks, I believe it looks better. And we're also publishing A Rough Night for the Queen, a story that Phil wrote, really a biography he wrote of Sir Richard Francis Burton. We've got the paperback here. This is a proof, and I don't have the proof of the hardcover. It's being done by a local printer. We've got signature sheets going all over the world right now. I think I talked about that in the other panel. But I wish, you know, unfortunately we're not going to all be seeing each other, hugging each other, meeting in person like we normally do. But hopefully this will be our only virtual FarmerCon. And in the future, we'll be back to doing this in person. I want to thank you both very much. You're on the West Coast. This is earlier in the morning for you. It's early afternoon for me. We won't talk about that because I messed up the times this morning and kind of screwed things up. But it has been a pleasure. This has gone great. I wish we could have done this in person. And who knows, maybe again sometime soon. So goodbye. Wave goodbye to everybody. And
thanks for moderating, Blake. And very nice.
Thanks for moderating. Nice to meet you, Chris.
Very nice to meet you too.
Yeah, all right.
I'll check out your book.
Okay.
I'm gonna order. I was gonna order one to hold up and surprise her, and then I just forgot to do it. So I'm an idiot. And then I was like, well, I could get the e-book. Yeah, that doesn't count. So, all right. So long, everybody.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.